Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Frank Weisenberger. I'm the convener of the Community of Practice Indigenous Conservation Standards Project, what is part of the Conservation Coaches Network. And our scaling strategy that we are presenting on today is about improving access to relevant adaptations of the conservation standards for Indigenous people and local communities to lead and effectively manage conservation initiatives on their territories. And our story starts over in Australia, in the very northwest in the Kimberley region, where our first adaptation of the conservation standards happened with the Weisenberger traditional owners, and they developed a healthy country plan, what was a locally relevant adaptation. From this first plan that happened over the years, to start off, so the unit we're talking about here are the territories of Indigenous people and local communities, where they, for example, would run an Indigenous Ranger program, or how is it called in North America, a Guardian project, or an Indigenous protected area or co-management area. So the unit for the purpose of this scaling project are the territories, the tribal lands of one Indigenous community. From the first project, we started running training events, developing resources for Indigenous people, what led over the years to a huge increase of healthy country planning around Australia. Over a period of roughly 13 years, we at the end established an area of 1.4 million square kilometers of Australian's landscape covered by healthy country plans, and that makes a contribution of roughly 22.9% to the National Reserve System. As well as a comparison, all those lands that you can see here on the map, kind of a makeup as well in area as a comparison, 90% of the National Reserve System. So Indigenous people making a very large contribution to the conservation estate in Australia. And we wanted to see how that can be applied elsewhere in the world. That is all in connection to global goals like 30 by 30, where Indigenous people will have to make, yet again, a Herculean effort of contributing to this very ambitious task. One of the key issues, though, is often that Indigenous people don't have necessarily the right tools to participate in those global conservation initiatives, and we've heard from many different parts in the world that they were lacking their ability to participate in a meaningful way. So as part of this project, we've done a very simplified system analysis on how Indigenous people are faring in different parts of the world. And we used two criteria: whether there is a national policy context that recognizes Indigenous people and provides a pathway to secure tenure as one criteria, and the second criteria being whether this national policy context actually provides the resources for conservation initiatives to undertake the management. We came up with three categories, and for those three categories helped us determining how we're dealing with different circumstances of system tilt. I want to just show you here like how that kind of would relate to the different scaling approaches. So often in those downward-facing system tilts, to overcome the first hump is actually the development of a locally relevant adaptation. So we're not talking about an adaptation that comes from somewhere else in the world, but something that is homegrown and what brings community ownership and empowerment of those communities. But once you overcome this first little hump, you actually kind of face a very favorable circumstance. That's been our experience in Australia. Once we had this first adaptation developed called healthy country planning, from then it spread like a wildfire across the north and then into the southern parts of Australia. In circumstances with a flat system tilt, where Indigenous people are recognized in the Constitution, but there's not necessarily clear pathways forward for management or to secure tenure. With a collective impact approach, you first of all may need to focus more on resourcing the planning efforts and the training efforts before you can actually start any scaling. Once you have the resources secured, there is then to overcome the issues of not having a locally relevant adaptation. You would then shift towards a diffusion approach to develop a locally relevant application. And in the cases where you have an upward system tilt, as we said previously, like you would not, first of all, to look at trying to influence through scaling approach 5 norms in those countries to increase recognition for Indigenous people. And then once Indigenous people are appropriately recognized, you can start with raising the required resources before you can look into actually scaling out. So that means in our circumstance, we are looking at those scaling approaches in a sequential way. In a downward system, you may need to do some resourcing before you can start with a diffusion model of developing a local relevant adaptation, and then you can start scaling out. In the second case that we showed beforehand, you kind of look first of all of creating those enabling conditions, raise the required resources. You may need to do a little bit of work around transforming system norms, but then you can start looking at scaling out and start with a diffusion approach to find a locally relevant adaptation that is accessible for the people in that country, when you then can continue with replication and expansion. And the other different approach in those upwards system tilt, you would look first of all at transforming the system norm, and then you would use approach 4 and 5 to create the enabling conditions before you can start scaling out. So our experience from an Australian point of view and through this learning network is that for a global project, it is hardly that you will only choose one scaling approach at a time, but much rather employ a suite of scaling approaches and you just sequentially stagger them across the lifetime of a project.